She stood in a room full of men in suits, her hands still stained with engine grease. Across from her sat the man that all of Chicago knew by one name, a name no one dared say out loud. She didn't tremble. She said just one sentence. "My father owed you. He's gone, and I'm here to pay." The room went silent. He looked at her not because he was impressed, but because in over a decade of sitting in that chair, hundreds of debtors had stood before him. Some ran, some knelt, some begged and wept, some lied and vanished. But not once, not a single time had anyone walked into this room and said, "Let me work it off." That was day one. What happened in the days that followed, no one could have seen coming. If this story touched you, hit like and share it so more people can hear it. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story, because the best one might be the one you haven't heard yet. 3 months before that girl walked into that room, Kira Donovan's life looked entirely different. There were no suits, no probing eyes, no heavy silence from people who held power. There was only a small repair shop at the end of a quiet road in the outskirts of Chicago, where the smell of engine oil had sunk into the brick walls, and the sound of a wrench striking metal was the most familiar sound of every day. The shop was called Donovan Auto, with no large sign, no advertising, only the reputation of a man who worked with both his hands and his word. That man was Patrick Donovan, her father. Patrick wasn't the kind of man who talked much. He belonged to that kind of man people had to understand by watching what he did, not by listening to what he said. Every morning he woke before dawn, opened the shop while the whole neighborhood was still asleep, and began working as if every day were the last day he'd ever be allowed to hold a wrench in his hand. Kira grew up right there inside that shop. While other children played outside, she sat on the iron chair beside the tool bench, watching her father take an engine apart and put it back together as though it were the simplest thing in the world. He never once said, "You have to learn this." He simply did the work, and Kira watched. Then, one day, she picked up a wrench on her own, opened the hood on her own, changed the first oil filter of her life on her own, without anyone telling her to do it. Patrick stood behind her, watching. He didn't say a word. He only gave the slightest nod. For him, that was enough. For Kira, that nod was worth more than every word of praise in the world. From that moment on, father and daughter worked side by side every day. They didn't need many words. They didn't need explanations. Patrick handed over a tool, and Kira knew what he needed. Kira tilted her head at a part, and Patrick understood what she was wondering about. They spoke in the language of metal, in the rhythm of work, in the kind of understanding that didn't need words. That was how they loved each other. Never loudly, never spoken aloud, yet steadier than anything else in the world. Donovan Auto was never rich, but it always earned enough for them to live. Until the local economy began to slide downhill, customers came less and less. Repair bills were paid late, and then not paid at all. The cost of keeping the shop running didn't go down. Patrick began taking extra work after hours, staying later, resting less. But every month the shortfall was worse than the month before. He didn't tell Kira. He didn't want her to worry. But she saw it. She saw him sitting at the kitchen table every evening, flipping through a stack of papers, one hand pressed to his forehead, letting out a long breath before folding everything up and putting it away the moment he heard her footsteps. When the shop was on the verge of closing, Patrick did the one thing he'd never wanted to do. He went back to see the people he had once known in his younger days, before he opened the shop, before he chose to live an honest life. He borrowed money from the Callaway organization, enough to keep the shop alive a little longer, with a promise that he'd repay it when things became stable again. Patrick was a man who kept his promises, and he believed he'd be able to repay it. But life doesn't wait. Only a few months after taking the loan, Patrick began showing strange symptoms. He was more tired than usual. His hands sometimes trembled when he held a tool. His strength faded little by little for no clear reason. He didn't go to the doctor right away because he thought he'd simply worked himself too hard. But when his body no longer allowed him to hide it, the doctor's results came down like a blow he didn't have time to avoid. The illness had advanced faster than anyone had expected. Patrick grew weaker, so quickly that Kira felt as though, with every passing day, her father lost another piece of himself. The man who had once lifted an entire car engine with both hands no longer had enough strength to sit up. The repair shop closed. The sound of the wrench fell silent. The smell of engine oil slowly thinned in the air. Kira became the only person left to care for her father. She didn't cry in front of him. She didn't ask why. She didn't blame life. She was simply there, every day, at his side, just as the two of them had once stood beside each other in the shop. They didn't need many words. Being there was enough, but both of them knew time wasn't leaving much behind. And the debt to the Calloway organization was still there, unpaid, like a shadow Patrick couldn't leave behind without first saying something about it. That night, the house held nothing but the sound of breathing. Not the ordinary breathing of someone asleep, but the kind of breathing that let anyone listening know it could stop at any moment. Kira sat beside her father's bed, her back resting against the wooden chair, both hands on her lap, her eyes never leaving Patrick. She had sat in that same place for several nights in a row, unwilling to leave even for a single minute, because she was afraid that if she stepped out of that room, everything would be different by the time she came back. Patrick lay in bed, far thinner than he had been only a few weeks earlier. The hands that had once held a wrench every day now rested motionless on his chest, the fingers stripped of their strength. His eyes were closed, but he wasn't asleep. Kira knew that, because now and then his lips moved as though he were trying to say something but still didn't have enough strength to turn it into words. Then he opened his eyes, slowly, painfully, as though the simple act of opening them had taken away another piece of the last strength he had left. He turned his head to look at Kira, and in that look she didn't see pain, she didn't see fear. She saw only something she had known for all of her 27 years. It was the seriousness of a man about to say the most important thing of his life. "Kira." His voice was low and rough, like wind slipping through a narrow crack in a door. She leaned closer and took her father's hand. His hand was cold, light, but when she held it, he still tried to squeeze back, however faintly. "I'm listening, Dad." Patrick looked at her for a few more seconds, as though he were trying to memorize his daughter's face one last time, and then he began to speak. Not quickly, not in haste, one word at a time. Slowly, because he knew he didn't have much time left, but he also didn't want to rush through the thing he needed his daughter to remember for the rest of her life. "I owe people money." Kira's face didn't change, but inside her, everything tightened. She knew about that debt. She had known for a long time. She had simply never asked, because she understood that her father didn't want to speak of it until he was ready. "I haven't paid it back." His voice trembled more then, not from pain, but from shame. Patrick Donovan was a man who had never owed anyone anything without paying it back. He had lived his whole life by that rule. His hands might not have made him rich, but his conscience had always been clean. And now, lying in this bed, knowing he was about to go while still carrying an unpaid debt that weighed on him more heavily than the illness itself. "The Donovans have never run from a debt." He said that with a firmer voice, as though he were pouring all the strength he had left into every word. "I'm not afraid they'll come to collect. I'm afraid of being remembered as a man who didn't keep his word." Kira tightened her hold on his hand. She understood. This wasn't about money. It was about who her father was. It was about the one thing he still had left when everything else had been taken from him. Patrick slowly moved his other hand down along the side of the bed, feeling beneath the pillow. Kira saw him pull out a small old key, the metal dulled by time, the key to Donovan Auto. He placed it in Kira's palm and gently pressed her fingers closed around it. "Keep it." Kira looked down at the key in her hand, then back at her father. Her eyes burned, but she didn't cry, not because she was strong, but because she knew that if she cried now, her father would worry, and she didn't want him carrying even one more burden in his final moments. "I promise I'll pay it back." She spoke softly, but her voice didn't waver. Patrick looked at her, and for the first time in many weeks, Kira saw something in her father's eyes that looked almost like relief. He didn't say anything more. He only gave the faintest nod, exactly like the nod he had once given her when she changed an oil filter by herself for the first time. Then he closed his eyes. Kira didn't let go of his hand. She sat there, holding it, listening as his breathing grew slower, softer, until the room held nothing but silence. The next morning, when the first light slipped through the window, Kira was still sitting in the same place. Her hand was still wrapped around her father's, but that hand was no longer warm. The key lay still in her other palm, cold as metal, yet heavier than anything she had ever held. She stood up, looked around the house. Everything was still in its old place, yet nothing was the same as before. The house was still there, but empty. The repair shop was still there, but its doors were closed, and Kira was still standing there, but alone. She walked outside without looking back. In her hand she held only the key and a promise. She didn't yet know how she was going to do it. She only knew that she would. The days after the funeral passed, in a kind of silence Kira had never known before. Not the ordinary silence of an empty house, but the kind of silence in which everything familiar was still there. Yet the person who had given those things their meaning was gone. Her father's coffee cup was still on the shelf. His work shoes were still beside the door. The smell of engine oil still lingered faintly in the air, but the shop was closed, and the house was empty, and Kira was alone with the key in her coat pocket, and a promise she still didn't know how to begin to keep. She didn't allow herself to sit still for too long, not because she was especially strong, but because she understood that if she stopped moving, the pain would swallow her before she managed to do anything at all. She began going through her father's papers, the bills, the small notes written in the familiar slope of his handwriting, trying to find some clue about the debt. He had left behind no clear contract, only a scrap of paper with the name Calloway and an address on the south side of Chicago. Kira stared at that piece of paper for a long time. She knew the name Calloway, not because her father had ever explained it in detail, but because of the way he had spoken it, always briefly, always carefully, as though the mere act of saying that name required caution. She didn't know much, but she knew enough to understand this wasn't a bank, wasn't a finance company. It was something else, and that something else wasn't the kind of thing a person could ignore and then hope would disappear on its own. Kira didn't wait for them to come looking for her. She went to them herself. The address on the scrap of paper led to a restaurant on the south side of the city. From the outside, it looked ordinary, even respectable, with a clean sign, clear glass doors, and warm light glowing inside. Anyone passing by might have thought it was just another restaurant like any other, but the moment Kira stepped inside, she knew at once that it wasn't. Not because the decor or arrangement looked unusual, but because of the way the people inside reacted when she appeared. There was no shouting, no one raising a voice or blocking her path. It was only the eyes. From the man behind the counter to the one sitting at the corner table, all of them looked at her in the same way, quick, sharp, assessing, as though they were asking themselves who she was and what she had come here to do. Kira walked to the counter, looked at the man standing behind it, and spoke plainly, without circling around the matter. "I need to see the person in charge. My father was Patrick Donovan. He had a debt here." The man behind the counter didn't answer, but his face changed at once when he heard the name Patrick Donovan. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't anger, but recognition, as though that name wasn't unfamiliar in this place. He looked at Kira for another second, then turned and said something quietly to the man beside him. That man disappeared into the back. Kira stood waiting. She didn't sit down, even though there was an empty chair right beside her. She didn't order a drink, even though someone asked. She simply stood there, both arms at her sides, her eyes fixed straight ahead, waiting. Around her, the restaurant kept operating as normal, but something in the air had changed from the moment she spoke her father's name aloud. The conversations at the nearest tables grew quieter. A few eyes still flicked toward her and then quickly turned away. No one said anything directly, but Kira could feel that everyone in that room knew exactly where she was standing, and that what she was doing wasn't ordinary. About 15 minutes later, a man stepped out from the back door. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with steady certainty, his face unreadable. He wasn't in a hurry, and he wasn't slow. He simply walked with the measured pace of a man who knew exactly where he was going and whom he was about to meet. He stopped in front of Kira and looked her over from head to toe, not with contempt, but with the look of someone measuring everything in the first few seconds. "Who told you to come here?" His voice was low and even, neither rising nor falling. Kira looked straight into his eyes. "No one. I came on my own." That man was Walsh. He didn't say anything else at once. He only looked at her for a few more seconds, as though weighing what kind of person the girl standing in front of him might be. Then he pulled out his phone, turned slightly to one side, and made a call. The call was very short. Walsh didn't say much, only a few words that Kira couldn't hear clearly. When he hung up, he turned back to look at her with an expression that had changed completely. Not friendlier, but more serious, as though the person on the other end of the line had said something that made this meeting no longer a small matter. "Come with me." Walsh led Kira through a corridor behind the restaurant and into an elevator, without saying another word the entire way. Kira didn't ask anything either. She simply followed, keeping her steps even, her eyes forward, her hands at her sides, When the elevator doors opened on the top floor, she found herself standing in a space completely different from the restaurant below. It was quieter, cleaner, and heavier. Not heavy because of the furniture or the decor, but heavy with the kind of invisible power people could feel the moment they stepped inside. 2 men stood on either side of the door, at the end of the hallway. They didn't look at her. They didn't speak. They simply stood there. Walsh knocked once, then opened the door without waiting for an answer, as though he already knew what the answer would be. And that was when Kira saw him. Reed Calloway sat behind a wide desk, his eyes lowered to an open file in front of him. He didn't look up right away when she entered, not because he was busy, but because he didn't need to hurry. In his world, everything moved according to his rhythm, not the other way around. Kira stood in the middle of the room, in exactly the position where she had stood in the first moment of this story, in a room full of men in suits, with traces of engine oil still staining her hands. She had already said what she came to say. Reed had heard her. And now, after that stretch of silence, he finally began. Reed closed the file slowly, then looked up at her. It wasn't a hostile look, and it wasn't a friendly one either. It was simply the look of a man long accustomed to reading other people, the way he would read a page, searching to see whether there was anything worth his time. Patrick Donovan. He spoke her father's name as though he were reading from a list. Borrowed money more than a year ago. Hasn't paid back a single dollar. Kira didn't react. She had already known that. Do you know how much your father owes? Kira looked straight into his eyes and said the number. Exactly. Not too much, not too little. Reed tilted his head the slightest bit, so faintly it was almost impossible to notice. That was the only reaction on his face. But Kira understood what it meant. He hadn't expected her to know that clearly. Most people who came here, if they came at all, usually didn't know exactly how much they owed. They circled around it. They guessed. They shaved the number down. This girl didn't. How long do you think it'll take? His voice stayed even, neither quick nor slow, every word placed exactly where it belonged. Kira didn't hesitate. However long it takes, I'm not going anywhere. Reed looked at her for a few more seconds, said nothing. Then he turned toward Walsh, who had been standing behind Kira from the moment she entered, and the 2 men exchanged a look Kira couldn't fully read. But she knew it was the look between the man who decided and the man who carried those decisions out. Reed turned back to her. Fine. 1 word only. No explanation. No long list of conditions. He laid down rules briefly, the same way he ran everything around him. Kira would work for the organization, starting at the lowest position in the restaurant downstairs. Every day she worked, the value of that labor would be subtracted directly from the debt. No wages, no cash. The more she worked, the smaller the debt became. She would stay in a room behind the restaurant, the kind reserved for low-level staff. It wasn't large, and it wasn't comfortable, but it gave her a place to sleep, and enough to survive. Reed said all of it in a flat voice without emotion, as though he were arranging some minor asset in a managed portfolio. Nothing more. Kira listened to every sentence. She didn't ask him to repeat anything. She didn't bargain. She didn't ask for a single extra thing. She only nodded once, firmly. Walsh stepped forward and motioned for her to follow him. Kira turned and walked toward the door. But before she could leave the room, Reed's voice came from behind her, no louder than before, yet clear enough for her to hear every word. Most people don't last more than a week. Kira stopped. She didn't turn back. She didn't look at him. She only stood there for a second, then answered in a soft voice that didn't waver at all. I'm not most people. Then she walked out. The door closed behind her. Reed sat still, looking at that door for a few more seconds. Walsh remained in the room, waiting. He didn't comment, but something had shifted in the air after the last sentence spoken by the girl who had just left. It wasn't admiration. Reed Calloway wasn't a man easily impressed by words, but he had taken note. In his world, where everyone either bowed their head or lied, a person who stood straight and told the truth was rare enough that he couldn't help noticing. He still didn't know how long that girl would last, but for the first time in many years, he wanted to see what would happen next. The first day began before sunrise. Walsh took Kira downstairs, led her through the back door of the restaurant into the kitchen and storage area. He didn't introduce her to anyone, didn't explain who she was, only said one sentence to the morning shift manager, that she would be working here starting today, then turned and walked away. No one asked anything else. No one greeted her. Kira stood in the cold kitchen, looked around, and found work for herself. No one assigned her anything specific. There was no schedule, no instruction. She only knew that she had to work, and she started with the nearest thing, the stacked crates left over from the night before that no one had cleared away, heavy, piled high, needing to be carried from the storage room into the kitchen before the morning shift could begin. She bent down, lifted the first crate, and started. The first days passed in a rhythm Kira had never known before, clearing tables, mopping floors, carrying supplies, taking trash out the back, washing kitchen tools, mopping the floor again, carrying more supplies. Each day looked like the one before it, but her body felt each day differently, because with every day that passed, her muscles hurt more, her back ached more, and her hands endured more. The old calluses from her father's repair shop hadn't even had time to fade before new calluses formed over them, the kind that belonged to someone hauling weight, entirely different from the calluses of someone holding a wrench. The skin on her hands blistered in new places. Some spots tore open from the constant friction of wooden crates and metal trays, but she didn't stop, didn't ask for bandages, didn't tell anyone. In the restaurant, no one treated her like a coworker. She was the girl working off a debt, the lowest status in a place where even the regular staff were only small gears inside a much larger machine. Everyone knew she was there, but no one spoke to her unless they needed to order her to do something. No one asked her name. No one asked where she came from. She existed in that space like a shadow, moving constantly from the kitchen to the floor, then down to storage, and back up again, over and over, from early morning until late at night. There were moments when she carried supplies past tables where customers were eating, sweat on her forehead, dirt on her hands, warehouse dust clinging to her clothes, and not a single person looked at her. Not because they were deliberately ignoring her, but because to them, she wasn't worth looking at. She didn't exist in their world. Kira didn't complain. Not once. She arrived earlier than anyone else, when the restaurant was still dark and empty. She left later than anyone else, when the kitchen lights had gone out and the night shift was finished. Between those two ends of the day, she did everything she was told to do and everything no one told her to do, because she understood that every hour she worked, the debt dropped a little more, and that little bit was all she had. Every night, when she returned to the small room behind the restaurant, a room with only a thin mattress on the floor, a small table, and nothing else, Kira sat down and took out the sheet of paper Walsh gave her at the end of each week. The paper showed the amount of debt still remaining. She stared at that number for a long time, every single time, stared at it as though trying to find change in it, and there was change, but very slowly. The number went down by such a small amount that sometimes she had to compare it with the week before just to notice the difference. She folded the paper, placed it beneath her pillow, then lay down. She said nothing, thought nothing more. She only closed her eyes and tried to sleep before her body had time to remind her that tomorrow would be exactly the same as today. Meanwhile, on another floor, in another room, Reed Calloway sat listening to Walsh give the end-of-day report. Numbers, incidents, names. Walsh moved through each item one by one, brief and professional, as always. And at the end of the report, almost as though it were only a side note, he mentioned Kira, not specially, not with emphasis, only as information. She hadn't missed a single day. Reed didn't look up at once. He kept his eyes on the papers in front of him, silent, then asked a question that under ordinary circumstances he would never have asked about someone working off a debt. "Is she doing the job well?" Walsh answered quickly, because he hadn't expected Reed to ask either. "No complaints, no mistakes." Reed said nothing more. He gave a faint nod, then turned to the next page of the report and moved on to another matter, as though the question had never been asked. But it had been asked, and Walsh knew that, because in more than 10 years working beside Reed Calloway, he had never once heard his employer ask about the work condition of a debtor. Not once, until today. It happened one evening, about 2 weeks after Kira began working at the restaurant. Reed came downstairs for a private meeting with a business associate, something that had nothing to do with her. Nothing to do with the small debt that was being reduced day by day in the books. The meeting ended late. The front of the restaurant had already closed, and only the light from the kitchen still spilled into the back hallway. Reed passed through the kitchen on his way out to his car, and that was when he saw her. Kira was crouched in front of a large refrigeration unit, the kind of industrial freezer the restaurant used to store ingredients. The machine had broken earlier that afternoon. Kira had heard the kitchen staff complaining about it, but no one had called a repairman because it was already late. And no one thought it needed to be fixed right away because it wasn't their job. But Kira knew how to fix it. She had grown up among machines, among wires and circuit boards and bolts. And the moment she saw broken equipment, her hands reached for tools before her mind even had time to ask whether this was supposed to be her job. She removed the back panel, checked the system, found the problem, and then began to repair it. No one had asked her to do it. No one knew she was doing it. At that hour, she was alone in the kitchen, and she was completely focused on the work in front of her. Her hands smeared with lubricant, her eyes narrowed under the neon light, her fingers moving with the kind of precision that said this was something she had done 1,000 times before. Reed stood at the end of the hallway, about 10 steps away from her. He didn't speak. He didn't signal that he was there. He only stood there and watched. And this time, his gaze was entirely different from the last. The first time he met her in his office, he had looked at a debtor. When Walsh gave his report, he had heard about an employee. But now, standing at the end of the kitchen hallway, watching that girl crouched in front of a broken machine, her hands streaked with oil, her hair damp with sweat, completely absorbed in what she was doing, he saw something else. She wasn't paying off a debt. She was doing the thing she knew how to do, the thing she was good at, the thing someone had taught her long before she ever stepped into this building. The way she held a tool, the way she tilted her head to listen to the sound of the machine, the way she paused for a few seconds to think and then continued, all of it carried the rhythm of someone who had been trained since childhood, not taught by books or classrooms, but taught by someone who passed down a craft through his own hands. Reed probably stood there for less than a minute, but that 1 minute was enough for him to see something he had never seen in the people who stood before him. This girl wasn't merely enduring. She was existing in the right way, even inside the wrong place. He turned and walked away without a sound. Kira never knew he had been there. The next day, Walsh came to find Kira while she was carrying supplies from the storage room up to the kitchen as she did every morning. He told her briefly that starting the next day, she would no longer be working in the restaurant. She was being moved to the organization's garage, where the vehicles for the team were maintained and repaired. Walsh didn't explain why. He didn't say who had made the decision. He only informed her and then left. Kira stood there for a second, watching him go, then turned back to the crate she had been carrying. She didn't ask why. She didn't look surprised or grateful. She simply took note of it and kept going, because in her mind at that moment there was only one task. Finish today, and tomorrow would be whatever tomorrow became. That afternoon, in the office on the top floor, Walsh stood in front of Reed's desk while the two of them were alone. The day's report was finished, the business matters had been handled, and before Walsh left, he paused for a beat and added one sentence he didn't usually say. "She's like old man Donovan. Doesn't know how to quit." Reed was signing a document. His hand stopped for less than half a second, then kept signing, his eyes never leaving the page. He didn't answer. He didn't nod. He showed no visible reaction at all. Walsh understood. He had worked with Reed long enough to know that when his employer said nothing, it didn't mean he hadn't heard. It meant he was keeping what he had just heard somewhere inside himself, in a place no one else was ever allowed to see. The next morning, Walsh took Kira to the garage, set behind a warehouse compound about 15 minutes by car from the restaurant. The organization's garage had no sign, no name, only a sliding iron gate and a gray brick wall surrounding it. From the outside, it looked like any abandoned industrial shop on the outskirts of Chicago. But inside, it was the place where the entire vehicle fleet for the Callaway organization was maintained and repaired. Walsh stopped the car in front of the gate, told Kira that from now on she would work here, then drove away. No introduction, no instructions. Exactly like the first day at the restaurant. Kira stood in front of the iron gate for a few seconds before stepping inside, and the very moment she crossed the threshold, something reached her from deep inside, so strongly that she had to stop. The smell of motor oil, not the smell of cooking oil from the restaurant kitchen, not the smell of cleaning chemicals she had grown used to over the past 2 weeks, but the real smell of motor oil, the smell of engine lubricant, of heated metal, of gasoline faint in the cold air, the smell of Donovan Otto, the smell of her father. She stood there at the entrance and drew in a deep breath without meaning to, and in that instant everything around her disappeared. There was no Callaway organization, no debt, none of the past 2 weeks, with blistered hands and eyes that treated her like air. There was only the smell of motor oil and the memory of early mornings when she stood beside her father in the shop, hearing wrenches strike against each other, watching his hands take a part apart and put it back together as though nothing had ever been broken. The garage was much larger than her father's shop, with 4 repair bays, each one holding a vehicle waiting for maintenance. White neon lights ran across the ceiling, flat and even, exactly like the kind of lights her father used. Tools hung on wooden boards along the wall, arranged by size, wrenches, sockets, pliers, screwdrivers. Every single thing so familiar that Kira could have named each one without even looking. There were 3 other mechanics in the garage, all men, all older than she was, all of them having worked there for a long time. When Kira walked in, they looked at her with the kind of look she had already grown used to. Not hostile, but doubtful. A young woman, small-framed, her hands still marked with blisters from hauling things at the restaurant, walking into a repair garage and being assigned as a mechanic. No one said it aloud, but they all thought the same thing. She wouldn't last here. Kira explained nothing. She walked straight to the nearest repair bay, where a car sat on the lift with its hood already open. She looked into the engine for a few seconds, made a quick assessment, then reached for a wrench from the tool board on the wall. The moment her hand touched the handle of the wrench, her body remembered. Not the kind of remembering that lives in the mind, but the kind that lives in muscle, in bone, in motions, repeated thousands of times from the time she was 12 years old until the day the shop closed. Her hands moved with precision, fast, without wasting a single motion. She removed the part that needed checking, examined it, identified the problem, then began to repair it. She didn't ask anyone. She didn't need anyone to guide her. She worked as though this was the place where she had always belonged. At first, the 3 mechanics in the garage didn't pay much attention. Then they began glancing over. Then they stopped their own work entirely just to watch. Not because she was doing anything spectacular, but because she was doing it right. Every step, every detail, right process, right pressure, right order. In a few places, she even handled things faster and more cleanly than the way they usually did. No one said anything, but the doubt in their eyes began to fade, replaced by something close to acceptance, even if none of them was ready to admit it out loud yet. When the first car was finished, Kira stepped back and stood still. She didn't look at the car. She looked down at her own hands. Black motor oil streaked across her fingers, in the spaces beneath her nails, across her palms. Exactly like her hands had looked every day when she still worked at the shop. Exactly like her father's hands, and for the first time since the night her father died, since the empty house, since she stepped into Reed Calloway's world and endured each day like a machine, a smile appeared on her lips. Very faint, very quick. Almost nothing more than the corners of her mouth turning upward for less than a second before disappearing. No one in the garage saw it, but it was there, and it meant more than any words ever could, because it was the moment Kira Donovan, in a place that wasn't hers, among unfamiliar people, beneath a debt she still had no idea when she would finish paying, found again a small piece of herself she had thought was gone. But from that same day on, her presence in the garage began to create something she hadn't expected. No one understood why a girl working off a debt had been moved from the restaurant to the garage, a place that held information about travel schedules, the vehicle fleet, and things outsiders were never supposed to know. No one asked directly, but in the quiet conversations among members of the organization, the name Kira Donovan began to be mentioned along with questions that had no answers. Who was she? Why was she really here? And who was standing behind her? It happened at the end of the 3rd week since Kira had been moved to the garage. The questions that had no answers, the ones people had been whispering to one another, finally reached the ears of a man who didn't believe in whispering. His name didn't matter. He was in charge of part of the organization's transport operations, mid-level, with enough authority to give orders to a few men under him, but not enough to sit at the same table with Reed. He was the kind of man who stayed overly alert because he knew how easily his position could be taken from him if something went wrong, and because of that, he saw threats everywhere. Kira had become that threat in his eyes from the day she appeared in the garage, a girl no one knew the background of. No one understood why she had been moved there, suddenly present in a place he considered sensitive. The garage wasn't just a place to repair cars. The fleet's destinations, what it carried, when it moved, which routes it took, all of that passed through this place. And an outsider, a girl working off a debt, Sitting in the middle of that information every day with no one able to explain why, that left him uneasy. He had asked a few people, but no one knew clearly. He didn't dare ask Walsh or Reed directly either, because he didn't have the standing. So he decided to find out in his own way. That evening, the garage was nearly empty. The 3 main mechanics had all gone home long ago. Kira was still there, cleaning up the tools after the shift, putting the wall rack back in order, wiping the floor in the area where she had worked that day. She always stayed the latest, not because anyone made her, but because she had nowhere else to go, and the work there at least gave her the feeling that she was doing something that meant something. She was wiping her hands with an old rag when she heard footsteps behind her. Heavy, steady, coming straight toward her. She turned and saw him standing less than 3 steps away. One shoulder angled slightly forward, his eyes fixed on her without blinking. He didn't charge at her, didn't shout, just stood there, blocking the only way out of the area where she was standing. "I want to talk." His voice was low, not loud, but deliberately pressed down to create pressure. Kira didn't step back. She set the rag down on the table slowly, then straightened and faced him. "Who are you?" he asked, but not in the way of a man who wanted an answer. He asked like a man who had already reached a conclusion in his own head and was giving her one last chance to admit it. "No one knows where you came from. No one knows who brought you in. And suddenly you're sitting here, right in the middle of the garage, hearing everything, seeing everything." He stepped closer, closing the distance. He didn't touch her, but he came near enough that Kira could feel his breath. "If you were planted here, I won't let it slide. I don't need to wait for anyone's permission." The air in the garage thickened. The neon lights on the ceiling still burned with the same flat brightness, but everything around them seemed darker, narrower, until it felt as though only 2 people remained standing face to face, in the middle of motor oil and silence. Kira looked straight into his eyes. She didn't tremble. She didn't step back. She didn't cry. Her voice was so calm it felt almost strange under those circumstances. "I came here because of my father's debt. I don't know anything about your business. If you don't believe me, ask your boss." He hadn't expected that answer. He had expected her to be afraid, to stumble over her words, to shrink back, or at least to lower her eyes. But she did none of those things. She simply stood there, looking at him with the eyes of someone who had nothing to lose and nothing to hide. He hadn't had time to say another word before the garage door behind them opened. There was no loud sound, only the faint pull of iron hinges, but it was enough to make them both turn. Reed Calloway walked in. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't slow. He moved with an even, calm step, as though he were crossing his own front hall on an ordinary morning, rather than stepping into a confrontation in a garage late at night. Walsh came right behind him, but stopped at the door. Reed walked straight in, stopped a few steps away from the 2 of them, and looked. He didn't look at Kira. He looked at the man. He only looked. He didn't say a single word. He didn't need to. In Reed Calloway's world, one look from him carried more weight than any threat anyone else could ever speak aloud. And the man standing in front of Kira understood that instantly. His face changed in less than a second, from the one in control to the one being controlled, just from the appearance of one man. He stepped back once, then twice, then turned, walked quickly past Walsh and out the door, disappearing into the darkness outside without looking back. The garage fell silent again. Walsh left after that too, pulling the door shut gently, leaving only 2 people behind, Kira and Reed. She stood in the same place, her hands still at her sides, her eyes still looking straight ahead. She didn't act grateful. She didn't act afraid. She simply stood there, calm, as though what had just happened was only another part of the long day she had to survive. Reed looked at her. This time he looked at her differently than before, not with assessment, not with curiosity, but with something else that even he himself hadn't yet found a name for. Then he spoke, his voice low and quiet, but every word clear. "You don't belong in this place." Kira looked at him. Silence held for a beat. Then she answered, not louder than he had, not softer than he had, only enough to fill the space between them. "But I'm still here." Reed looked at her for a few more seconds. He didn't nod. He didn't shake his head. He didn't say anything else. Then he turned and walked away, the sound of his shoes landing softly on the concrete floor until the garage door closed and Kira was left alone again, beneath the neon lights and the smell of motor oil. She didn't know why he had come. She didn't know who had told him. She only knew that the sentence he had just spoken, "You don't belong in this place," wasn't entirely a warning. There was something else in it. She wasn't sure what it was, but she realized that for the first time since she had stepped into Reed Calloway's world, someone had stood between her and danger, and that person had been him. A few days after what happened in the garage, Kira was called up to the main headquarters that morning. It wasn't Walsh who called for her, but a mid-level manager in the organization, the kind of man responsible for arranging logistics for meetings and internal events. He wasn't part of the group that knew Kira had been threatened, wasn't part of the group that knew Reed had intervened, and he most certainly wasn't part of the group that knew Reed had begun to notice this girl. In his eyes, Kira was only a name at the bottom of the personnel list, a person working off a debt, the lowest rank in the whole system, and because of that, she could be ordered to do any task at all, without anyone needing to ask whether she agreed. He met Kira in the ground floor hallway, and said quickly that the upstairs meeting room needed to be cleaned before an important meeting at 9 o'clock. The floor had to be mopped, the tables and chairs had to be arranged, and everything had to be finished before people came in. He said it, and walked away without waiting for Kira to answer, without looking back, as though he had just given an order to a piece of equipment instead of a human being. Kira stood still for a second, then went to find a bucket of water and a rag. She didn't protest. She didn't ask why. She didn't stop to wonder whether this was even her job. She had learned long ago that in a place like this, asking why didn't bring answers. It only brought trouble. She carried the bucket upstairs and walked into the meeting room. The room was wide, with a long table in the center, leather chairs lined along both sides, and a polished tile floor. No one was there yet. She set the bucket down, wrung out the rag, bent over, and began wiping from the farthest corner of the room. She cleaned each square of tile, each section of floor, moving slowly and carefully, not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because that was how she did everything. Her father had taught her that if something was worth doing, it was worth doing right. No job was ever so small that it could be done carelessly. When she had cleaned about half the room, people began to come in. One by one, men in suits stepped into the meeting room, pulled out chairs, and sat down. No one looked at her. Or more precisely, they looked but didn't see, because in their eyes, the girl bent over, wiping the floor beneath their feet, wasn't a human being with a presence in the room. She was only part of the preparation, like the table that had been wiped down, like the glasses of water already set in place. One more thing that had to be there so everything would be clean before the important men sat down. One man stepped right across a section she had just mopped without bothering to avoid it. Another set a cup of coffee on the table and accidentally spilled a few drops onto the floor right beside where she was wiping, without saying sorry, without even glancing down. Another gave a quiet little laugh when he saw her bend lower to wipe beneath a chair. A brief sound, passing, not openly cruel but with not a trace of respect in it either, only the reflex of someone seeing another person lower than himself. Kira didn't look up. She didn't react. She didn't let anything change on her face. She simply kept wiping, one tile after another, steady and calm, as though no one around her existed at all. Then Reed walked in. Kira didn't see him, because she was bent over wiping near the end of the table, her eyes fixed on the floor. But she heard the room change the moment he appeared. The small conversations paused for half a beat. The scraping of chairs became more deliberate. The air grew a little heavier. That was the effect Reed created every time he entered a room. He didn't need to say a word. His mere presence was enough. Reed pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. And when he sat, his eyes moved across the room the way they always did, quick, precise, taking in everything in a single instant. And he saw her, Kira Donovan, bent over the tile floor, a rag in her hand, in the middle of a room full of men sitting in leather chairs, sweat on her forehead, traces of motor oil still on her hands from the garage, not yet fully washed away, her knees touching the cold floor. Reed said nothing. His face didn't change. He didn't look at her any longer than would seem ordinary. He didn't let anyone in the room realize that he was noticing the girl mopping the floor. He only sat there in silence, and the meeting began. But there was one thing that, if anyone in that room had been observant enough, they might have noticed. From the moment Reed sat down until Kira finished wiping the floor and stood up, he didn't smile. Not once. While the people around him went on talking as usual, while some of them still glanced down at her and then looked away, While one or two gave light little laughs, Reed Calloway was the only person in that room who wore no expression at all except silence. Kira finished the last square of tile. She rose slowly, folded the rag, picked up the bucket of water. Then she turned to look at the manager who had assigned her the task, the man sitting halfway down the table with his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him. "It's done. Anything else?" Her voice was calm. Not angry, not wounded, not sarcastic. Just a direct question, spoken in the voice of someone already used to being treated as nothing, and who had accepted that fact without letting it break her. The manager didn't look up. He only flicked his hand in a gesture telling her to leave. Kira turned and walked out of the room, the door closing behind her. The meeting continued. And when the meeting ended, when everyone began filing out one by one, no one noticed that Reed Calloway was the one who remained seated the longest. He stayed there for nearly another minute, looking at the empty space where Kira had stood before leaving, and only then did he rise. 2 days later, the mid-level manager who had assigned Kira to mop the floor was transferred somewhere else. No one announced the reason. No one asked. He simply disappeared from the main headquarters, as though he had never been there at all. And Kira never knew about it. She didn't know who had done it. She didn't know who had sat in that room and watched her bent over the tile floor without smiling. She only knew that the next morning, she still woke early, still went to the garage, still picked up a wrench, and still kept going. That night, when Kira returned to the small room behind the restaurant, she didn't turn on the light right away. She closed the door, stood in the dark for a few seconds, her back resting against the wooden door, and simply breathed. Not the breathing of someone who had run out of strength, but the kind of breathing that belongs to a person who has held everything inside for too long and needs one moment, unseen by anyone, to allow herself to weaken, if only a little. She turned on the light. The small room appeared exactly as it did every night. The thin mattress on the floor, the small wooden table against the wall. Nothing else. No photographs, no personal belongings. Nothing to suggest that this was the place where a human being lived rather than an empty corner of some forgotten storage room. Kira sat down on the mattress slowly, feeling each muscle aching after the long day. She pulled from beneath her pillow the sheet of paper Walsh gave her at the end of each week, the paper with the remaining debt written on it. She opened it and looked at the number. She had looked at that number every night, and every night it had gone down a little. But tonight, after everything that had happened, after the days bent over the garage floor, after being stopped and threatened, after the morning spent bent over tile in front of men sitting in leather chairs while no one truly saw her, the number on that piece of paper looked different. It wasn't smaller. It looked larger, far larger than everything she had endured. And in that moment, the distance between where she was standing and where she needed to reach became so clear it almost stole her breath. She had worked every day without rest. She had endured everything without complaint. She had stood straight when threatened, had stayed calm when treated as though she didn't exist. And after all of that, the number on the paper was still so large that she didn't dare calculate how many more days it would take, how many more months, how many more times she would have to bend down before it was paid off. The tears came before she could stop them. Not loud crying, not sobbing, just tears running down in silence, so quietly that if anyone had been standing outside the door, they wouldn't have heard a thing. Each drop fell onto the paper, blurring the printed ink, fell onto the hands holding it, hands layered with calluses over older calluses, skin cracked between the fingers, motor oil still trapped deep in the roughened skin no matter how many times she washed. She wanted to stop, not quit. Kira Donovan didn't know how to quit. She had proven that every day since her father died. But she wanted to rest. Just one day, just one night without thinking about the number on the paper, without thinking about having to get up early tomorrow, without thinking about anything at all. She wanted to breathe without feeling as though every breath had to pay for something. She sat there, the tears still falling, and in that silence, memories came rushing back. Not memories of the last night, not the instructions whispered from the sickbed, not the debt, but smaller things. So small that under ordinary circumstances she would never have thought of them, and yet now they were clearer than anything else. Her father's hands holding a wrench, thick fingers, rough, always stained with oil, always steady. The way he leaned over the open hood, eyes narrowed, mouth whistling some tune with no name she had ever known, a small habit she had listened to for more than 20 years and had never once asked about, because she had always assumed there would be time to ask later. The way he looked at her the first time she changed an oil filter by herself, not saying well done, not clapping, only giving the slightest nod before turning back to his own work, but Kira had seen the corners of his eyes bend, and she had known it was the smile he kept hidden because he didn't want to look soft. Those memories weren't grand. They weren't dramatic. There was no lesson in them, no deep wisdom behind them. They were only ordinary moments between a father and a daughter in a small repair shop. Mornings when the smell of coffee mixed with the smell of motor oil. Afternoons when sunlight slanted through the garage window, her father's whistling mingling with the sound of metal striking metal. The most ordinary things. And because they were ordinary, losing them hurt more than anything else. Because no one prepares you for losing ordinary things. People prepare for the great losses, for funerals, for wills, for debt. But no one prepares for the fact that you will never hear that whistle again. Kira sat still for a long time. The tears gradually stopped. Not because she forced them to, but because they ran out on their own. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and saw the damp trace on her skin mix with the motor oil that still remained there, leaving a faint gray streak across her cheek. She looked down at the paper in her hand, blurred at the corner by tears. She folded it carefully, gently, then placed it back beneath her pillow. She lay down. The mattress was thin, the floor hard beneath it, the ceiling low above her. She closed her eyes. She made no promise to herself. She didn't tell herself she would be stronger. She didn't repeat the promise she had made to her father. She didn't think about tomorrow. She knew only one thing, that tomorrow morning, before the sky was light, she would open her eyes again. She would stand up again. She would walk out of this room again. And she would begin again, not because she wanted to, but because she didn't know any other way. The next morning, Kira still got up, exactly as she had known she would. Her eyes were still slightly swollen from the night before, but she didn't look in the mirror. She didn't need to confirm something she could already feel more clearly than anyone else. She washed her face with cold water, changed her clothes, stepped out of the room while the sky was still not fully light, and walked toward the garage as she did every day. But that day wasn't like every other day. Walsh had already been standing at the garage gate, waiting for her. He didn't go inside. He simply stood outside, his hands in the pockets of his coat, his face as expressionless as always. When he saw Kira approach, he said briefly that she would no longer be working in the garage. Starting today, she was being moved to the main headquarters of Callaway Holdings. Her new work would be arranging documents, checking files, the kind of administrative work she had never done before. Walsh didn't explain why. He didn't say who had made the decision. He didn't say whether this was a promotion or a reassignment or anything else with a name. He only informed her, then motioned for her to get into the car. Kira didn't ask. She had already grown used to the way things operated here. An order came, and she followed it. Reasons weren't meant for someone like her. She got into Walsh's car and watched the garage grow smaller in the rearview mirror. The place where, even in only a few weeks, she had found again the smell of her father's motor oil, had smiled for the first time since everything fell apart, and had also nearly been threatened in the dark by a stranger. She didn't know whether she would ever come back there. She only knew that she was being taken somewhere else, and in that place, everything would begin again from the start. Callaway Holdings headquarters stood in the center of Chicago, a tall building of glass with a broad lobby. Kira had been there once before, on the first day when Walsh took her up to meet Reed, but that time she had only passed through the hallway and gone straight upstairs, without enough time to notice anything. This time, when she entered as someone who would be working there every day, she felt the difference more clearly. This place wasn't like the restaurant. It wasn't like the garage. There was no smell of food, no smell of motor oil, no noise from the kitchen or the sound of metal striking metal. There was only silence. The kind of silence that didn't come from the absence of people, but from people who didn't speak, unless speaking was necessary. The polished stone floor reflected the white light from the ceiling. Every footstep echoed softly and evenly, clear in the wide space. Everything here was clean, orderly, controlled. This was where Reed Callaway lived and worked every day, the center of everything he ran, and Kira had just stepped directly into that center. Walsh brought her to an area at the end of the upstairs hallway, near Reed's office. There was a small desk, several stacks of documents that needed sorting, files that had to be checked and organized. The work wasn't physically heavy like the restaurant or the garage, but it demanded care and precision. Walsh showed her what needed to be done and then left. And Kira began at once, without waiting, without asking anything more, just as she always did. The first day at headquarters passed in silence. Kira worked at her desk. Reed worked in his office only one door away. The two of them barely spoke. Once, Reed passed by her desk on his way out. He glanced at the stack of documents she was arranging, then kept walking without stopping. Another time, Kira brought a completed file she had finished organizing and placed it outside his office door, knocked twice, then returned to her desk without waiting for him to open it. There was no conversation, no exchange worth naming, but something had changed, and both of them felt it even though neither said a word. Kira was here now, inside his space, breathing the same air, hearing the same silence, existing only a few steps away from him every day. And Reed, a man long accustomed to no one daring to come near him without permission, now had a girl sitting just outside his office door, quietly sorting documents, asking for no attention, making no attempt to speak, making no effort to impress, simply there. And it was precisely that simple fact, that she was simply there, that made it impossible for him not to notice her. Each day, more clearly than the one before. The first question came on her third day at headquarters. Kira was sitting there sorting through a stack of old files, heavy bundles of paper yellowed along the edges, when the door to Reed's office opened and he walked past her desk. He moved more slowly than usual, for no clear reason, then stopped for exactly half a step, his eyes dropping to the stack of files in front of her. "What did your father do before he opened the shop?" The question came without warning, without preface, without context, as though he had been thinking about it for a long time and had only now decided to speak, right in the middle of passing by, right in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, as though it didn't matter. But both of them knew it mattered, because Reed Calloway didn't ask about things he didn't want to know. Kira looked up at him for a second, then answered. "He used to work as a mechanic for this organization, before I was born." Reed showed no clear reaction, but he didn't keep walking. He stood there for another beat, as though the answer wasn't what he had expected, but also wasn't what he hadn't expected. Then he gave the slightest nod and walked on. He asked nothing more. The day ended there, but the next day he asked again. Kira was sorting documents near the door to his office, and Reed was standing in the doorway, a cup of coffee in his hand, his eyes on the hallway, while his voice was directed toward her. "Did you know about that?" "My father didn't hide it," Kira said, her hands still turning pages. "He said it was a part of his life he didn't regret, but he didn't want to go back to it." Silence. Reed took a sip of coffee, then turned back into his office. The door didn't close all the way. Kira noticed that, but said nothing. She simply kept working. And so it went, day by day, question by question. Never many, never long, just small fragments tossed into the silence, as though Reed was testing how far she would answer, and Kira was answering with such exactness that he couldn't find a reason to stop. One morning, he asked her when she had learned to fix cars. Kira answered without needing to think. "From the moment I was tall enough to reach the hood." That was the first time Kira saw the corner of Reed's mouth change. Not a smile, not clearly enough to call it that. Only a very brief moment when the muscles in his face eased, almost too faint to notice, and then it was gone. But Kira saw it, and she understood that she had just said something that touched a place he hadn't covered in time. Another afternoon, Reed asked whether her father had ever said anything about the organization. Kira said her father had spoken of it very rarely. He only said it once, that there are places a person walks into and never walks out of. He got out, and he didn't go back, not until there was no other choice. Reed stayed silent after that longer than he had any of the times before. He stood by the office window with his back to Kara, looking out over the city below. Kara didn't know what he was thinking. She only knew that he didn't move on to another subject, didn't brush it away, didn't ask anything more. He simply stood there with her father's words hanging in the air between them. None of their exchanges ever lasted more than 3 sentences. Question, answer, silence. Question, answer, silence. But inside that repeated rhythm, something was shifting, slowly, almost too faint to see, yet real. Reed Calloway, the man who had built walls around himself taller than any building he owned, was lowering them 1 brick at a time, not because Kira was trying to tear them down, but because she answered plainly. No embellishment, no exaggeration, no omission, No effort to please him, no plea for pity. She told the truth, brief and clean. The way she wiped each square of tile, the way she repaired each part of a machine, precise and without excess. And that plain, unadorned truth was exactly the thing Reed almost never encountered, because in his world, people always said what they thought he wanted to hear, never what was actually true. Then one day, when Kira set the last file of the week on his desk, Reed looked at her and asked a question unlike any of the ones before. "How much is left?" Kira understood at once what he meant. She looked at him, stayed silent for a beat, then answered, "A lot." She didn't give the number. She didn't complain. She didn't explain. Just 2 words. But inside those 2 words lived every night she had sat staring at that piece of paper. Every day she had bent over tile floors, all the patience and exhaustion she never spoke aloud. Reed looked at her longer than usual. Then he said, his voice low and slow, as though he were speaking more to himself than to her, "You've lasted longer than anyone I've ever known." Kira didn't answer. She only looked at him for another second, then returned to her desk and went back to work. But that sentence remained in the room after she had sat down, remained in the air between them, remained longer than any sentence Reed had ever spoken to anyone, because it wasn't only an observation. It was Reed Calloway's way, in the fewest words possible, of admitting that the girl sitting outside his office door had done the thing he hadn't believed anyone could do. She had stayed. There was one thing no one at headquarters knew, not even Walsh, not even Reed. Every afternoon after work ended upstairs. Kira didn't go straight back to her room. She took a bus to the garage, the place where she had worked before being moved to headquarters, and she repaired cars. No one assigned her the work. No one paid her. No one knew she was there. She went because it was the only place where she felt close to her father. The smell of motor oil, the sound of a wrench, the feeling of her hands doing exactly what they had been taught to do. Those afternoons in the garage were the only time in the day when Kira didn't feel as though she was paying off a debt. She felt as though she was living, but her body didn't agree with that schedule. Kira had no income. Every day she worked, the value of her labor went directly toward the debt, and not a single dollar reached her hand. The small amount of savings she had left from before her father died slowly ran out, and she began cutting the only thing she could cut, food. At first, it was only breakfast that disappeared. Then lunch became a small roll bought from the cheapest shop near the restaurant. Then there were days when she ate only once, in the evening, and even that one meal wasn't enough for someone working from early morning until late at night. Her body reacted slowly. She didn't collapse all at once. It was the kind of weakening that came day by day, each day taking a little more strength without ever giving anything back. Her hands began to tremble slightly when she held a wrench too long. Her vision blurred a little by late afternoon. Her head sometimes spun when she stood up too quickly. But she didn't stop. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't allow her body the right to be weak, because weakness meant stopping, and stopping meant the debt would still be there, whole and waiting for her. That afternoon, Kira was halfway through repairing a car in the garage. It was familiar work, not especially complicated. Her hands moved by habit, the wrench turning steadily, sweat forming lightly on her forehead, even though the weather wasn't hot. She had been there about an hour, and her body began sending signals she had grown used to ignoring. A little dizziness, a slight tremor in her hands, a faint blur at the edges of her sight. She gripped the wrench tighter, took a deeper breath, tried to focus on the part she was still repairing in front of her. Then everything went black. Not gradually. No final warning. Just one moment she was still standing, and the next she wasn't. She collapsed onto the concrete floor of the garage, her body falling to one side, her right hand still gripping the wrench as though even unconscious. Her body still refused to let go of the only thing that connected her to her father. The key she wore around her neck, on the thin chain she always kept hidden beneath her shirt, slipped out when she fell and came to rest on the concrete floor beside her throat, gleaming beneath the neon light. Reed found her. He had come down to the garage because Walsh had reported that the security cameras had recorded someone entering the garage after hours for several weeks, and when they checked, it was Kira. He wanted to see for himself what she was doing, not because he was suspicious, but because of something else he didn't say aloud. When he stepped inside and saw her lying on the floor, he stopped, not because he was shocked. Reed Calloway wasn't a man easily shocked. He stopped because the sight in front of him touched a place in him he had thought had closed long ago. The girl lay there, thinner than the first time he had met her, small against the wide concrete floor, still holding the wrench, her face pale, sweat damp across her forehead, and on the floor, right beside her throat, the small metal key lay still, shining under the light. He stepped closer, bent down, looked at the key. He didn't know what it was. He didn't know the story behind it, but he knew it mattered, because she wore it every day, hidden inside her shirt, close to her chest, as though it were the last thing she still had left. He reached out, gently picked up the key, and tucked it back inside her shirt, carefully, slowly, as though he were touching something more fragile than any agreement he had ever signed. Then he stood and called Walsh. When Kira opened her eyes, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling was higher than the one in her room. The light was different. The smell was different. She was lying on a leather sofa, soft and warm, nothing like the thin mattress on the floor she had grown used to. She blinked a few times, trying to orient herself, and then she realized this was Reed's office. She knew because every day she placed files outside this room, and had seen inside through the door whenever it opened. But she had never entered it. No one entered it. This was the place where even Walsh stepped in only when called, and she was lying on the sofa in here. On the small table beside the sofa was a tray of food. Porridge, bread, a bottle of water. Simple, but enough. Kira looked at the tray, then turned toward the other side of the room. Reed sat at his desk, about 10 steps away from her, his head bent over a file, a pen in his hand, reading and making notes. He didn't look at her. He didn't ask whether she was awake. He didn't ask how she felt. He simply sat there working, as though everything were completely normal, as though having a girl lying on the sofa in his private office was something that happened every day. Then he spoke, without looking up, his voice low and even, only 2 words. Eat. Kira looked at him for a few more seconds. He still didn't look up. She turned back to the tray of food, and for the first time in a very long while, she picked up the spoon without needing anyone to tell her a second time. She ate, slowly, in silence, in the office of the most powerful man in Chicago, a man sitting 10 steps away from her and pretending not to care, while everything he had just done, from the key he had tucked back inside her shirt, to the tray of food on the table, to the office door he had opened to let her in, said one thing and one thing only, the very thing he would never say aloud himself. Kira left the office after dark. She didn't say thank you. She didn't apologize for causing trouble. She only set the spoon back on the tray, stood up, looked at Reed for a second, then walked out. The door closed softly behind her, and the room returned to silence. Reed was still sitting at his desk. The file in front of him was still open, but he wasn't reading it anymore. The pen was still in his hand, but he wasn't writing. He sat there, looking into the empty space before him, and for the first time in a very long while, Reed Calloway wasn't thinking about work, wasn't thinking about the organization, wasn't thinking about the numbers and the deals and the power he managed every day. He was thinking about a small key lying on a concrete floor. After a while, he set the pen down and pulled open the right-hand drawer of his desk. He rarely opened that drawer. Inside there were no business files, no contracts, nothing connected to the work he did every day. There were only a few personal things he had kept for reasons he never explained to anyone. He took out an old envelope, the paper yellowed along the edges, one corner slightly curled by time. The envelope had no stamp, no postmark. It had been delivered directly into his hands, more than a year earlier, through Walsh, from a man Reed had never met in person but had known by name for a very long time, Patrick Donovan. Reed pulled the letter from the envelope, a single sheet of white paper, written by hand in blue ballpoint ink. The handwriting was uneven, trembling, slanting to the right, with some of the letters blurred where the writer's hand had no longer been strong enough to hold the pen steady. It was the handwriting of a man who was gravely ill, writing in his final days, trying to place on paper the things that mattered most before the chance was gone. Reed had read this letter before. The first time was when Walsh gave it to him. He had read through it, taken note of it, then put it away. At that time it had been only a letter from a debtor, nothing more. But tonight, after seeing the daughter of the man who wrote it lying on the garage floor, with the old key slipping out from beneath her shirt, every word on this page carried a different weight. Patrick wrote that he knew he didn't have much time left, that the illness had reached the stage where the doctors no longer spoke of treatment, only of the time remaining, that he was sorry for the unpaid debt, not because he feared the consequences, but because he was a man who kept his word. and leaving this world without keeping that promise was something he couldn't accept, even from a sickbed. Then at the end of the letter, Patrick wrote 2 lines that Reed read more slowly than the rest. "I will pay it. If I don't make it in time, my daughter will pay it. She's like me. She doesn't know how to quit." Reed looked at those lines. The trembling of the handwriting was clearer at the end, as though Patrick had poured all the strength he had left into writing those last words before the pen slipped from his hand. He had written about his daughter with the certainty of a man who knew exactly what he was saying. Not hope, not pleading, a statement. Patrick Donovan, lying in a sickbed, knowing he was about to die, had not asked for the debt to be forgiven, had not asked for it to be reduced, had not asked for more time. He had written that his daughter would pay, and his daughter had come, had worked, hadn't given up, exactly as he had said. Reed folded the letter again, slowly, each crease falling into its old place. He placed it back into the envelope, put it back in the drawer, closed it. Silence. He leaned back in his chair and looked up at the ceiling, and in that stillness, something rose up from a place he had buried for a very long time. His father, the man who founded this organization, the man who built everything from nothing with his own hands, the man who had also kept his word the way Patrick Donovan did, and the man who had also lost everything because he trusted the wrong person. Reed had grown up with that lesson carved into his bones. Keeping your word is a weakness. Trusting people is a mistake. Never let anyone come close enough to hurt you. He had lived by those rules for more than 10 years, and they had kept him alive, kept him in this position, kept him safe. But the girl who had been lying on the sofa in his office a little while ago, the girl who held onto a wrench even when she fainted, the girl who wore her father's old key against her chest every day, the girl who had kept her promise to her father even though no one was forcing her to keep it. She wasn't weak. She was the strongest person he had ever met. And if she was that strong and still kept her promise, then maybe keeping your word wasn't weakness. Maybe it was something else. Something he had refused to believe in his whole life. Reed sat motionless in the darkening office, without turning on another light, without calling for anyone, without doing anything at all. He simply sat there, with the letter in the drawer, and a thought he already knew wouldn't disappear when morning came. The next morning, when Kira arrived at headquarters and sat down at her desk as she did every day, the door to Reed's office opened. He stood in the doorway, looked at her, then said 2 words he had never said to her before. "Come in." Kira stood up and walked into the office. She had stood in this room once before, the first time she met Reed, but that time she had remained standing. This time, Reed pointed to the chair across from his desk. "Sit." Kira sat down. She didn't know what was about to happen, but she could feel that today was different, not because the air was tense, but because it wasn't. For the first time in all the moments she had been near Reed, he didn't carry that familiar sense of control. Something had shifted in the way he looked at her, and Kira noticed it, even though he didn't show it clearly. Reed didn't begin at once. He sat across from her in silence for a few seconds, as though arranging in his mind what he wanted to say. This wasn't the kind of silence he usually used to make others wait. This was the silence of a man trying to say something he wasn't used to saying. "I knew your father." Kira tilted her head slightly but said nothing. She waited. "Patrick Donovan. He worked for this organization when my father was still running it. The best mechanic this organization ever had." Reed spoke slowly, 1 sentence at a time, his eyes fixed on Kira. Then he left. Not because he was forced out, not because he caused trouble. He just wanted a different life, and he made it happen. Silence. Kira swallowed lightly but kept her face steady. She had never heard anyone speak about her father this way. From the other side, from the perspective of the people her father had left behind. When he came back to borrow money, it was the only time in more than 10 years that I've sat in this position and had a debtor look straight into my eyes and tell me exactly how much he owed, how long he needed, and why he needed it. No more, no less, no lies. Reed paused. Then he asked, his voice lower, softer than any question he had ever asked her. "Would your father want to see you living like this?" The question landed like a cut Kira hadn't prepared for. She had prepared for everything. For hard work, for contempt, for threats, for loneliness, for exhaustion. But she hadn't prepared for this, because it didn't come from outside. It went straight inside, to the place she had hidden most carefully, where she kept her image of her father and the promise she had used to justify everything. She was silent. For a long time, longer than any silence between them before. Then she answered, her voice quiet, but true. I don't know. I only know I made a promise. Reed looked at her for another second. Then he opened the right-hand drawer, took out the old envelope he had read again the night before, and placed it on the desk, sliding it gently toward her. Your father sent this before he died. Kira looked at the envelope on the desk. Her hand didn't reach for it right away. She looked at the handwriting on the front, her father's handwriting, the kind she recognized instantly even after so long, and something tightened in her chest. She picked up the envelope, pulled out the letter, and opened it. Handwritten lines, trembling, slanted to the right, blue ink on white paper. She read each line slowly, as though every word carried a voice she had thought she would never hear again. Her father apologized for not paying the debt. He explained about the illness. He wrote about the shame of not keeping his word. Line by line, she could hear his voice in her mind, see him sitting on the edge of a bed, his hand shaking as he tried to keep the pen steady even when his body refused. Then she reached the final lines. I will pay it. If I don't make it in time, my daughter will pay it. She's like me. She doesn't know how to quit. Kira's hand trembled. Not from cold, not from weakness. It trembled because she had just read something her father had never said to her while he was alive. He believed in her. He believed in her enough to write those words, to send them to the man he owed, to place her as the guarantee for the final promise of his life. Not because he forced her, but because he knew she would do it. Tears rose, but Kira didn't let them fall. She held them back, the way she had held everything back for so many weeks. But this time it was harder, far harder, because this wasn't the pain of loss. This was the pain of realizing she had been loved more than she had ever known, and the person who loved her was no longer there for her to say thank you. Reed watched her from across the desk. He saw her hand tremble on the paper. He saw her eyes redden, even though not a single tear fell. And he spoke, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of everything he had observed, everything he had thought, everything that had changed in him since she arrived. He was right. You don't know how to quit. Silence. Then he spoke again, slower, softer, but more certain than any order he had ever given. The debt is paid, not with money. Kira looked up at him. Her eyes were still red, her hand still trembling slightly on the letter, but she didn't understand at once. Or maybe she did, but she didn't dare believe it. Reed continued, a few short sentences, no philosophy, no unnecessary words, only truth. That he had wanted to erase this debt for a long time, but his father had once trusted the wrong person, and the price of that trust had been everything. So he had never allowed himself to repeat it, never allowed himself to trust anyone until he was certain. And Kira had given him that certainty, not through words, but through every day she woke up, stepped out of that small room, and kept going. No one forced her, no one watched her, no one promised her anything if she endured. She did it because that was who she was, and that was something Reed had thought no longer existed in this world. The room stayed silent after what Reed had just said. Kira still sat there with her father's letter in her hands, her eyes lowered to the trembling handwriting on the page, and she didn't know how to respond, because never once through this entire journey had she imagined it would end like this. She had prepared herself for a long road. She had prepared herself to bow her head and keep working for many more months, many more years if necessary. She had not prepared herself for someone to look at her and tell her that she had done enough. Reed didn't rush her. He sat there and waited. Not with the kind of waiting that wanted a quick answer, but with the kind of waiting that belongs to someone who understands that there are moments which need time to settle before a person can say anything at all. Then he spoke again, his voice still low, still calm, but carrying something Kira had never heard in it before. Respect. Not the polite kind of respect. The kind of respect a person feels after seeing someone at their weakest and still recognizing their strength. I want you to stay. Kira looked up. Not to pay off a debt. The debt is gone. I want you to stay because you deserve to be here. You'll manage the garage. The garage. The place where the smell of motor oil had pulled her back to her father's shop the first time she stepped inside. The place where she repaired the first car and smiled for the first time since her father died. The place where she had been threatened and stood her ground. The place where she had collapsed onto the concrete floor with the key slipping out from under her shirt. Reed hadn't chosen it at random. He knew that was where she belonged. Kira looked at the letter in her hands, looked at her father's handwriting, looked at the final line. She's like me. She doesn't know how to quit. She folded the letter carefully, then placed it on Reed's desk. He looked at it but said nothing. Then Kira lifted her hand to her throat and touched the thin chain she had worn ever since the night her father gave her the key. She took it off. Slowly, every movement carried weight, because that key wasn't only metal. It was the repair shop. It was the mornings with her father. It was the promise. It was the reason she got up every day when everything inside her wanted to lie down and never rise again. She placed the key on Reed's desk, right beside the letter. Metal touched wood with a soft sound in the silent room, quiet but clear. She looked at the key lying there on the desk, farther from her than it had been at any point since that night. And in the moment the key left her, she felt something she hadn't expected. Lightness. Not the lightness of letting go, but the lightness of finishing. She had made a promise to her father, and she had kept it. The silence lasted for several seconds. Reed looked at the key on the desk, then looked at her. He said nothing. He waited. Then Kira reached out, picked up the key, and put it back around her neck, slowly, carefully, as though she were wearing it for the first time. But it was different. The first time, her father had given her that key together with a debt, a promise, a burden. This time, she placed it back on herself, and the burden was gone. Now the key wasn't an obligation. It was memory. It was her father. It was Donovan Otto. It was the sound of morning whistling. It was the nod he gave her when she changed an oil filter by herself for the first time. It was all the most ordinary things she would keep forever, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Kira looked at Reed. "I'll stay." 2 words, just like every sentence she had spoken before, short, direct, without excess. But this time, those 2 words carried a meaning completely different from anything she had ever said before. The first time she stood in this room, she said, "Let me work," because she had to. Now she said, "I'll stay," because she chose to stay. Not out of duty, not because of debt, not because of a promise to the dead, but because it was her choice, for herself, for the first time since all of this began. Reed nodded, a faint nod, almost too slight to notice, like the nod of a man who wasn't used to showing much, but wanted her to know that he had heard, had understood, and had accepted. Kira stood up, took her father's letter, and walked out of the office. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Because for the first time since the night her father died, she wasn't walking forward because she feared what was behind her. She was walking because ahead of her was a place where she belonged. Because in the end, not every debt in this world is paid with money. Some debts are paid by becoming exactly the person the people who loved us always believed we would become. We'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to listen to today's story. If this story touched your heart, please press like and share it so more people can hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you can listen to more engaging stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a comment below. We truly hope to hear what is in your heart, because every comment you leave is the greatest encouragement for us to keep creating meaningful stories. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and more peace with every passing day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.